I thought I'd seen everything in my 15 years of living in Copper Ridge Estates, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. The moment I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday morning in October, I knew something was off. They're spray painted in bright orange across my pristine white garage door were the words "Violation Notice" in block letters 3 feet tall. What the hell, I muttered, stepping out of my Honda Pilot. The autumn air in Scottsdale was still warm, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd left for my overnight business trip to Phoenix 2 days ago, and my garage door had been perfectly normal. My neighbor Mrs. Chen was watering her desert landscaping next door. She looked up and shook her head sympathetically. "Oh, Janet," she called over. "I tried to call you yesterday when they did that. Did you get my voicemail?" "They, who's they?" I walked over to the property line, my heels clicking on the concrete. At 52, I prided myself on maintaining professional standards even when I was just getting home from a client meeting. The HOA enforcement team. That new woman, Mrs. Kowalski, she brought some guy with the spray paint. Said your garage door was in violation of community standards. I stared at her. Violation of what standards? It's white. It's always been white. It's the same color as every other garage door in this neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's expression grew uncomfortable. Well, that's just it. She said it wasn't the right shade of white, said it was too bright, that it violated Section 4.7 of the Architectural Guidelines about approved paint colors. Section 4.7. I felt my blood pressure starting to rise. Helen, that's insane. This house was built by the developer. This is the original paint. I know, but she had some kind of color reader thing like what they use at Home Depot. She held it up to your door and said it didn't match the approved white. I walked back to my garage and stared at the orange graffiti covering my door. Beneath the spray paint, I could make out an official HOA violation notice stapled to the wood. I yanked it free and read it quickly. Property violation issued to 4847 Desert Willow Lane. Garage door painted in non-approved color, bright white FFF, vers approved antique white F8F, FM8. Fine $150 per day until corrected. Appeal process, contact HOA board within 5 business days. I crumpled the notice in my fist. And this was ridiculous. I'd served on this HOA board myself 3 years ago, and I'd never heard of such microscopic color enforcement. But Mrs. Kowalski had been elected president just 6 months ago, running on a platform of maintaining property values through strict adherence to community standards. I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA office. Copper Ridge Estates HOA, this is Brenda. Brenda, hi, this is Janet Williams on Desert Willow Lane. I just got home to find my garage door spray painted with a violation notice. Can you explain what's going on? Oh, hi, Janet. Yes, Mrs. Kowalski left a note about your property. She said she'd been by several times to inspect and found your garage door was painted in an unauthorized color. Brenda, this is the original paint from when the house was built in 2009. How can the original builder's paint suddenly be unauthorized? Well, according to Mrs. Kowalski, the architectural guidelines were updated last month to require more precise color matching. She has a digital color reader now, and she's been going through the neighborhood checking compliance. I closed my eyes and counted to 5. Brenda, who authorized her to spray paint my garage door. That's vandalism. Oh, that's not vandalism. That's the new enforcement procedure. Instead of sending multiple notices that people might ignore, Mrs. Kowalski decided to mark violations clearly so residents would take them seriously. She defaced my property. It's removable paint, Janet. You can paint over it when you fix the violation. I hung up and immediately called Mrs. Kowalski's number, which I'd unfortunately memorized during her aggressive campaign for HOA president. Hello, this is Sandra Kowalski, HOA president. If this is about a violation, please reference your notice number when you leave your message. Of course she wasn't answering. I left a message anyway. Mrs. Kowalski, this is Janet Williams at 4847 Desert Willow Lane. You spray painted my garage door, and I want this resolved immediately. Call me back at 480-550147. While I waited, I walked around my property looking for any other signs of Mrs. Kowalski's enforcement activities. My house was a standard desert contemporary beige stucco with white trim sitting on a quarter-acre lot with professionally maintained xeriscaping. Everything looked exactly as it had when I left for Phoenix. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Janet, this is Sandra Kowalski. I got your message. Sandra, what the hell gives you the right to spray paint my garage door? Please watch your language, Janet. I was enforcing community standards as outlined in the updated architectural guidelines, which were mailed to all residents last month. I never got any mailed guidelines. Then you need to update your mailing address with the management company. Regardless, ignorance of the guidelines isn't an excuse for noncompliance. I took a deep breath. Sandra, this is the original paint from the builder. How can that suddenly be non-compliant? The architectural guidelines require antique white for all garage doors. Your door is painted in bright white, which creates visual discord with the community aesthetic. I measured it with a calibrated color reader. Visual discord, Sandra, you can't tell the difference with the naked eye. Sorry, that's exactly the problem, Janet. When standards are left to subjective interpretation, property values suffer. Objective measurement ensures consistency. Objective measurement. I was starting to raise my voice despite myself. You spray painted my garage door over a difference that requires a machine to detect. The violation notice explains the appeal process. You have 5 business days? Now I have other properties to inspect, so if there's nothing else, there is something else. You vandalized my property. I want it cleaned off immediately. It's not vandalism, it's enforcement marking. You can paint over it when you repaint the door in the correct color. Have a good day, Janet. She hung up on me. I stood in my driveway staring at the orange graffiti, feeling angrier than I'd been in years. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I'd served on the board, volunteered for community events, and maintained my property meticulously. And now some self-appointed color police had defaced my house over a microscopic paint shade difference. I called my husband Mark at his office. Honey, you're not going to believe what happened. Wait, what's wrong? You sound upset. I explained the entire situation. Mark was quiet for a long moment. She spray painted our garage door over the color being too bright. Apparently, the difference between bright white and antique white is destroying our community's property values. That's insane. Can she do that legally? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. I'm calling Jim Reynolds. Jim Reynolds was our neighbor 4 houses down and a real estate attorney. He'd helped us with our property purchase and had become a friend over the years. Jim, it's Janet Williams. I need some advice about HOA enforcement. I explained the situation again. Jim listened without interrupting. Janet, that's concerning on several levels. First, spray painting your property without your consent could constitute criminal mischief under Arizona law, regardless of her HOA authority. Second, the enforcement of architectural guidelines has to follow proper procedures. Did she give you advance written notice before marking your property? The notice was stapled to the door after they spray painted it. That's backwards. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1803 requires advance written notice and an opportunity to cure before any enforcement action. I'd like to see these updated guidelines she's referencing. She said they were mailed last month. I never got them. Even if they were mailed, any changes to architectural guidelines typically require a membership vote unless your CC&Rs specifically allow the board to make unilateral modifications. Do you have your original CC&Rs handy? Where it couldn't. I'll find them. Jim, what are my options here? Several. You can file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA management companies. You can also file a police report for the property damage, and you should definitely appeal through the HOA process to create a paper trail. Will you help me with the appeal? Of course, but Janet, document everything. Take photos, keep all written communications, and start talking to your neighbors. If Mrs. Kowalski is doing this to you, she's probably doing it to others. After hanging up with Jim, I walked through the neighborhood with my phone camera documenting every garage door. As I suspected, they all looked virtually identical to mine. All white, all clean, all completely normal. I knocked on doors and talked to neighbors. The stories I heard made my blood boil. Tom and Sarah Martinez at the end of the street had been fined $300 for having desert broom plants in their backyard that were allegedly 2 inches taller than the height restriction in the landscaping guidelines. The Johnsons had been cited for parking their Honda Civic in their driveway, overnight violating a no economy cars visible from the street rule that nobody had ever heard of. Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s, had been fined $450 for having a garden gnome that violated the no decorative figurines policy. By evening, I had talked to 14 neighbors, and 12 of them had received violation notices in the past 2 months, all for things that had been perfectly acceptable for years. I called an emergency meeting for Friday night at my house. Word spread quickly, and by the time Friday came around, 32 residents crowded into my living room and spilled onto my patio. Thank you all for coming, I said, standing in front of my fireplace. I think it's clear we have a problem. Mrs. Kowalski has issued dozens of violation notices for things that were never violations before. She fined us $200 because our front door is dark blue instead of the approved navy, said Carol Henderson. We painted it 3 years ago with approval from the previous board. She said my rose bushes were too tall, added Maria Santos. They're the same height they've been for 8 years. Bob Crater, a retired electrician, stood up. I'll tell you what this is about. It's about control. She ran for president promising to raise property values, and now she's creating problems so she can solve them. Classic power trip. The question is, what do we do about it? I asked. Jim Reynolds, who'd been quietly taking notes, stood up. First, everyone here needs to appeal their violations through the proper channels. That creates a legal record. Second, we need to see these updated guidelines she keeps referencing. If they weren't properly approved, they're not enforceable. What if they were properly approved? Asked Tom Martinez. Then we need to look at whether they were properly distributed to homeowners. And we need to examine whether the enforcement procedures are being followed correctly. Mrs. Chen raised her hand. What about recall? Can we vote her out? Absolutely, Jim said. Arizona HOA law allows for recall elections. You need signatures from 20% of the membership to trigger a recall vote. I looked around the room. How many people here would support a recall effort? 31 hands went up. Only Bob Crater abstained. I'm not against it, Bob said. But I want to try working within the system first. Maybe we can reason with her. Over the next week, I threw myself into documenting Mrs. Kowalski's enforcement activities. I created a spreadsheet of every violation notice issued since she took office. The pattern was clear. She was targeting longtime residents with arbitrary rule interpretations, while newer residents, who might support her, seemed to avoid scrutiny. I also researched the architectural guidelines she kept citing. After digging through the HOA management company's files, I found the problem: the updated guidelines had never been voted on by the membership. Mrs. Kowalski had created them herself and instructed the management company to begin enforcement without proper authorization. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Kowalski for the following Tuesday. Sandra, thank you for meeting with me. I hope this won't take long, Janet. I have several more properties to inspect today. We were sitting in the HOA office conference room, a small space with fake wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Mrs. Kowalski was a thin woman in her early 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a navy business suit and carried a thick folder labeled Violations. I want to discuss the architectural guidelines you've been enforcing. They're quite clear, Janet. I don't understand what there is to discuss. I slid a copy of the original CC&Rs across the table. According to Section 7.3 of our governing documents, any modifications to architectural guidelines require approval by a majority of the membership. Can you show me the voting records for your updated guidelines? Mrs. Kowalski's expression tightened. The board has authority to interpret and clarify existing guidelines without a membership vote. But these aren't clarifications, Sandra. You've created entirely new restrictions. No economy cars visible from the street, no decorative figurines, precise color matching with digital equipment. None of these were in the original guidelines. Property values in this community have stagnated, Janet. Strict enforcement of aesthetic standards is necessary to protect everyone's investment. I pulled out my laptop and opened a real estate website. Actually, property values in Copper Ridge Estates have increased 8% over the past year, outpacing the Scottsdale average. Your enforcement isn't protecting property values, it's harassing residents. I resent that characterization. Then let's talk about procedure. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1803 requires advance written notice before enforcement action. Why are you spray painting garage doors first and delivering notices afterward? Mrs. Kowalski stood up. I don't have to justify my enforcement methods to you, Janet. If you don't like how this community is managed, you're free to move elsewhere. Actually, Sandra, you do have to justify your methods. You're an elected official accountable to the residents. And speaking of residents, I've been talking to quite a few of them about your enforcement activities. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you. 31 residents attended a meeting at my house last Friday to discuss your violation notices. We've documented dozens of improper citations, enforcement of non-existent rules, and procedural violations. We're prepared to file complaints with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. Mrs. Kowalski's face flushed red. You're organizing against me. We're exercising our rights as homeowners. Your violations are arbitrary, your procedures are improper, and your guidelines were never legally approved. She gathered her papers and stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. Sandra, wait. This doesn't have to be adversarial. Rescind the invalid violations, follow proper procedures going forward, and put any new guidelines to a membership vote. That's all we're asking. What you're asking for is chaos. Without strict enforcement, this community will deteriorate into a collection of rundown properties that drag down everyone's equity. Strict enforcement of legitimate rules, yes. Harassment based on made-up restrictions, no. She headed for the door, then turned back. Janet, I know you've been going door to door stirring up opposition. That kind of behavior is detrimental to community harmony. I'd be very careful if I were you. Is that a threat? Icky. It's a warning. Good day. She left and I sat in the empty conference room feeling like I'd just poked a hornet's nest. Mrs. Kowalski clearly had no intention of backing down. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever. I was right. The next morning, I found a new violation notice on my front door. This one cited me for unauthorized landscape modification because I had apparently moved 2 decorative stones in my front yard. The fine was $200 per day until corrected. The stones in question were 2 pieces of red sandstone, each about the size of a football, that had been sitting in the same spots near my front walkway for 12 years. I hadn't touched them. I called Jim Reynolds immediately. Jim, she's retaliating. Another bogus violation notice for moving rocks that I haven't moved. Janet, this is getting serious. I think it's time to file that police report for the garage door vandalism, and we need to document this pattern of harassment. Wahoo, what about the recall petition? Start it today. I'll help you with the legal language. We need to move fast before she escalates further. That afternoon, I drafted a recall petition citing Mrs. Kowalski's violation of proper procedures enforcement of unauthorized guidelines and retaliation against residents exercising their legal rights. Jim reviewed the language, and by evening we had a document ready for signatures. The response was overwhelming. Within 3 days, I had signatures from 48 residents, well over the 20% threshold required to trigger a recall election. But when I delivered the petition to the management company, I got an unpleasant surprise. I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams, said Brenda, the office manager. Mrs. Kowalski has instructed me not to accept any recall petitions. She doesn't have the authority to block a recall petition, Brenda. Arizona law guarantees homeowners the right to recall board members. You'll have to take that up with Mrs. Kowalski. I called Mrs. Kowalski immediately. Sandra, I just tried to file a recall petition and was told you're refusing to accept it. The petition is invalid, Janet. It contains false and defamatory statements about my performance. It contains factual statements about your enforcement activities. You don't get to determine whether a recall petition is valid. As HOA president, I have broad discretion over administrative matters. You have no discretion over recall petitions. That's established in state law. We'll see about that. I've consulted with the HOA's attorney, and he agrees that defamatory recall petitions can be rejected. I was livid. Sandra, you're way out of line here. Accept the petition or I'll file a complaint with the Department of Real Estate tomorrow. File whatever you want, Janet. I'm protecting this community from your disruptive influence. She hung up on me again. Jim was furious when I told him what happened. Janet, she absolutely cannot block a recall petition. That's a clear violation of Arizona HOA statutes. We're filing that complaint with the state, and I'm also going to send her a letter explaining her legal obligations. What if she just ignores your letter? Then we escalate. I can file for a temporary restraining order compelling her to accept the petition, but that's expensive and time-consuming. Let's try the formal legal notice first. Jim's letter was 3 pages of detailed legal citations delivered by certified mail the next day. Mrs. Kowalski signed for it at 2:47 p.m. according to the tracking information. Her response came at 8:30 that evening in the form of another violation notice on my door. This one cited me for creating a nuisance by organizing disruptive activities that interfere with peaceful enjoyment of the community. The fine was $500 per day. I photographed the notice and called Jim immediately. She's completely lost her mind, he said after I read him the violation. Creating a nuisance by organizing residents, Janet, that's a blatant violation of your First Amendment rights. HOAs can't restrict political speech or organizing activities. What's our next move? You-1-1-1-1. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing for an emergency restraining order. This has gone way beyond normal HOA disputes. She's engaging in harassment and retaliation, and she's violating state law by blocking the recall petition. Time bridge, sir? How long will that take? Emergency hearings usually happen within a few days. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, keep copies of all notices, and don't engage with her directly anymore. Let me handle all communication. Friday morning, I woke up to find my driveway blocked by orange traffic cones and violation tape stretched across my front walkway. A large sign staked into my front lawn read, "This property is under HOA enforcement action. Do not disturb violation markers." It looked like a crime scene. I called Jim and he rushed over with a camera. "Janet, this is incredible. She's essentially placed your home under some kind of quasi-legal quarantine. I've never seen anything like this." We documented everything, then Jim called the Scottsdale police. Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, a middle-aged Hispanic man with graying temples and a no-nonsense attitude. "Ma'am, can you explain what's happening here, Sir?" I gave him the full story from the spray-painted garage door to the blocked driveway. He took notes and examined the violation notices. "Sir," he said to Jim, "in your legal opinion, is this criminal behavior?" "I believe so. She's repeatedly damaged property without consent, which could be criminal mischief. She's also engaging in harassment and potentially false imprisonment by blocking access to the driveway." Officer Martinez nodded. "Ma'am, I'm going to file a report. You can also file for a restraining order through the courts. This kind of behavior isn't acceptable, HOA or no HOA." After the officer left Jim and I removed the cones and tape, Mrs. Kowalski could complain all she wanted, but she had no legal authority to blockade my property. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. Jim spent the weekend preparing our case while I gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed Mrs. Kowalski's escalating behavior. Mrs. Chen had seen her taking photographs of my house at night. Tom Martinez had watched her measuring the height of residents' mailboxes with a ruler. Carol Henderson reported that Mrs. Kowalski had been sitting in her car outside various homes taking notes. By Sunday evening, we had statements from 15 neighbors describing increasingly bizarre enforcement activities. Monday morning, I met Jim at the Maricopa County Courthouse. Mrs. Kowalski was already there with the attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Catherine Walsh from a Phoenix law firm. "Your Honor," Jim began when our case was called, "Mrs. Williams is seeking an emergency restraining order to stop ongoing harassment and retaliation by the president of her homeowners association. Mrs. Kowalski has spray-painted my client's garage door, issued violation notices based on non-existent rules, blocked my client's driveway with traffic cones, and refused to accept a legally valid recall petition." Judge Henderson, a stern woman in her 50s, reviewed our documentation. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Reynolds. What's the respondent's position?" Mrs. Kowalski's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, Mrs. Kowalski is simply fulfilling her duties as HOA president. She has broad authority to enforce community standards, and Mrs. Williams is attempting to use the courts to avoid compliance with legitimate architectural guidelines." "What about blocking the driveway?" the judge asked. Mrs. Kowalski was marking a violation area to prevent tampering with enforcement activities. "It's a standard procedure." Judge Henderson looked skeptical. "Standard according to whom? What authority gives her the right to block residents' driveways? The HOA's enforcement powers under the CCNRs and state law. I'd like to see those specific provisions." Mrs. Kowalski's attorney shuffled through her papers. "We'll need to file a supplemental brief with those citations, Your Honor." "In other words, you don't have them," the judge said dryly. She turned to Jim. "Mr. Reynolds, what specific relief is your client seeking?" "We want Mrs. Kowalski ordered to stop issuing violation notices based on unauthorized guidelines, to accept the recall petition as required by law, and to refrain from any further harassment or retaliation against Mrs. Williams." The judge considered for a moment. "I'm going to grant a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing. Mrs. Kowalski, you are ordered to cease all enforcement activities against Mrs. Williams' property until this matter is resolved. You are also ordered to accept any recall petitions that meet statutory requirements. Any violation of this order could result in contempt charges." Mrs. Kowalski's face went pale. Her attorney whispered something in her ear. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "my client believes this order is overly broad and could interfere with her legitimate HOA duties." "Your client's interpretation of her duties is precisely what's at issue here. The order stands. Full hearing is scheduled for next Friday at 9 a.m. Outside the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "That went well," Jim said, "but she's going to be furious. Be extra careful this week." He was right. Tuesday morning, I found a certified letter from Mrs. Kowalski's attorney accusing me of defamation and demanding $50,000 in damages for harm to Mrs. Kowalski's reputation. It's a slap suit, Jim explained when I called him. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's trying to intimidate you into dropping the recall effort. We'll file a motion to dismiss, but don't let it scare you off. These rarely succeed. Wednesday, Mrs. Patterson called me in tears. Janet, I just got a notice that my HOA dues are being raised to $400 a month because I'm a high-maintenance resident requiring additional enforcement activities. Is that legal? No, it's absolutely not legal. Individual residents can't be charged different dues rates. I'll call Jim right away. By Thursday, 3 more neighbors had received similar letters about increased dues. Mrs. Kowalski was clearly retaliating against anyone who had signed the recall petition. Friday's hearing was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood and dozens of residents came to watch. Judge Henderson looked surprised at the crowd. Mr. Reynolds, you have additional evidence? Yes, Your Honor. Since the temporary restraining order, Mrs. Kowalski has attempted to charge recall petition, signers increased HOA dues as retaliation for their political activities. We have documentation of at least 4 residents receiving these notices. Jim presented the letters and Judge Henderson examined them carefully. Ms. Walsh, how do you explain these differential fee assessments? Mrs. Kowalski's attorney looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, Mrs. Kowalski has discretion to assess additional fees for properties requiring enhanced enforcement. Enhanced enforcement of what your client is under a restraining order, preventing enforcement activities against these properties. The fees are prospective, Your Honor, based on anticipated future enforcement needs. Judge Henderson stared at her. You're saying your client is charging residents higher fees because she anticipates they might violate rules in the future? That's one interpretation, yes. That's an absurd interpretation. Mrs. Kowalski, stand up. Mrs. Kowalski rose shakily to her feet. Ma'am, you are an elected official in a residential community, not a dictator. You cannot spray paint residents' property, you cannot charge different fees based on political activities, and you cannot refuse to accept recall petitions. Your behavior has been so far outside acceptable bounds that I'm extending the restraining order indefinitely. Your Honor, Mrs. Kowalski's attorney tried to interrupt. I'm not finished. Mrs. Kowalski, you will immediately rescind all violation notices issued since you took office that are based on guidelines not properly approved by the membership. You will accept any recall petitions that meet statutory requirements. You will refrain from any enforcement activities until your HOA's procedures are brought into compliance with state law. Any violation of this order will result in immediate contempt proceedings and possible jail time. The courtroom was silent. Mrs. Kowalski looked like she might faint. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering your HOA to hire an independent management company to oversee all enforcement activities until this matter is resolved. Mrs. Kowalski will have no involvement in day-to-day operations. After the hearing, residents crowded around Jim and me in the courthouse hallway. Does this mean the violations are rescinded? Asked Tom Martinez. All of them based on unauthorized guidelines, Jim confirmed, which appears to be most of what she's issued. What about the recall election? Asked Carol Henderson. She has to accept the petition now. The election should happen within 30 days. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm. Janet, thank you for fighting this. I was so afraid to speak up on my own. We all stood up together, I said. That's what made the difference. Over the next week, I watched Mrs. Kowalski's enforcement empire crumble. The independent management company reviewed all violation notices issued during her tenure and rescinded 63 of them as based on unauthorized guidelines. Residents who had paid fines received refund checks. The recall petition was officially accepted and processed. The election was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Mrs. Kowalski made one last desperate attempt to save her position, sending a letter to all residents claiming I was a radical activist trying to destroy property values through anarchistic opposition to reasonable community standards. The letter backfired spectacularly. Even residents who hadn't been directly affected by her enforcement activities were offended by the tone and accusations. Jim helped me draft a calm, factual response, explaining the recall issues and my actual positions on community governance. Election day was held on a Saturday in the community clubhouse. I served as an election observer watching as a steady stream of residents cast their ballots. The results weren't even close, 147 votes for recall, 23 against. Mrs. Kowalski was officially removed from office. The victory celebration was held at my house that evening. Nearly 50 neighbors came by to share food, drinks, and stories about their experiences with Mrs. Kowalski's enforcement regime. "You know what the crazy thing is?" said Bob Crater, sipping a beer on my patio. "She probably thought she was helping the community. In her mind, she was the only thing standing between us and neighborhood decay. The road to tyranny is paved with good intentions," mewed Jim. She convinced herself that her methods were justified by her goals. Mrs. Chen raised her wine glass. "To Janet for having the courage to stand up when the rest of us were too intimidated. To all of us," I corrected. "None of this would have worked if people hadn't come together." The interim board appointed to replace Mrs. Kowalski took a completely different approach to community governance. They held open meetings, solicited input before making changes, and focused enforcement on legitimate safety and maintenance issues rather than microscopic aesthetic details. Property values continued to rise, community complaints dropped to near zero, and the neighborhood felt peaceful again. 6 months later, I was elected to serve another term on the HOA board, this time as secretary. My campaign platform was simple, transparent governance, reasonable enforcement, and respect for residents' rights. Mrs. Kowalski moved away 3 months after the recall election. I heard she bought a house in a new development where she could start fresh. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I suspected she probably blamed us for not appreciating her efforts. The orange spray paint on my garage door took 2 coats of primer and 3 coats of antique white to fully cover. I kept the original violation notice framed in my home office as a reminder that even the most ridiculous abuse of power can be overcome when people work together. I still walk through the neighborhood regularly, but now it's to chat with neighbors about normal things like weather sports and weekend plans. Nobody measures paint colors with digital equipment or counts the inches on desert plants. The decorative stones in my front yard haven't moved in 13 years and nobody cares. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had just quietly repainted my garage door instead of fighting back. Mrs. Kowalski would have continued her arbitrary enforcement. Residents would have lived in fear of random violation notices, and our community would have become a place ruled by intimidation rather than cooperation. The experience taught me that unreasonable authority relies on people's reluctance to make waves. When residents decided they'd rather deal with the temporary conflict of a recall election than live under arbitrary rule indefinitely, Mrs. Kowalski's power evaporated almost overnight. Democracy works even in a homeowners association, but only if people are willing to participate in it. 3 years later, Copper Ridge Estates is thriving under reasonable governance that balances community standards with individual rights, proving that you don't need a dictator to maintain property values. You just need neighbors who respect each other enough to work together toward common goals. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.